Greetings, friends. This is Chris Batts, your host of the Law Firm Leadership Podcast. Kicking off season 2, in today's episode, I spoke with and learned about a corporate attorney who was inspired by his father's work in Houston with NASA, putting the first humans on the moon. Like NASA doing something never done before, my guest is interested in seeing the same innovation applied to the corporate legal department. Just a reminder, the PDF transcript of this audio is available to download. Go to liongrouprerecruiting.com/podcast. As many of you know, we interview corporate defense law firm leaders, partners, general counsel, legal consultants, and you are listening to episode 31 of the Law Firm Leadership Podcast.
Broadcasting from Kansas City, this is the Law Firm Leadership Podcast. In each episode, you'll receive actionable ideas and hear personal leadership stories of both men and women serving as leaders and executives in the legal industry. Enjoy a front row seat as Chris Batts speaks with general counsel, legal consultants, and law firm leaders and law partners at the top corporate defense law firms from around the United States.
Welcome to the Law Firm Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Batts with the Lion Group. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Angelo, former head of legal technology and innovation at Smiths Group PLC and general counsel of the largest operating division, John Crane. Since 2009 at Smiths Group, Jay has served in several roles, including general counsel for 3 of the 5 divisions and global head of litigation, all the while taking on an emerging role within the legal department called the head of legal technology and innovation. Prior, he worked for several publicly traded companies, including Move Inc., AMS Inc., and J2 Global Communications. He began his legal career at the DC office of Wilkie Farr and Gallagher. Mr. Angelo received his JD from George Washington University School of Law and undergrad from Georgetown University. Welcome, Jay, to the Law Firm Leadership Podcast. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you, Chris. Happy to be here.
So, Jay, I was I guess I could use the word tickled or excited. You have a rather intriguing background, and even all the way going back to your genesis with what your dad did. And I just want to ask the opening question, because I mentioned a title that most people will have never heard of within a corporate legal department. But how did you become the head of legal technology and innovation within a huge publicly traded multinational? What is the role? What are some of the successes or discoveries being in that role?
I think it wasn't really planned, certainly not planned by me. It was really an organic path that both Smiths Group and I took. It really started in 2016 when I had been at Smiths for a while, and I was the general counsel of one of the divisions, and I was heading up global litigation. We got a new CEO at that time, and he had a software background, and he looked at Smiths Group and said, really, your 5 divisions, which are industrial divisions, need to be infused with software and digital advanced materials. And so Smiths Group had to innovate and become more modern. And at about the same time, I had wanted to relocate back to California with my family, and I wanted to get more involved in software. And so Smiths saw an opportunity for me to do both and for me to head up a new legal function within the larger department, which is legal tech and innovation. And my focus, even though I had to do a number of things, my real focus for the last few years was helping Smiths Group stand up their digital function, which consisted of a new business head of digital and pulling together 300 or so software engineers.
So this was a function of supporting the lines of business, is what you're saying, or a specific line of business?
Correct. Smiths Group already had plenty of software engineers, but they had not centralized the function under a specific leader. So as they were doing that, the global general counsel tapped me to be his counterpart and to move to California, where he was based, and to help him stand up the digital and software function for the entire team. And then the innovation piece was just something that I had been doing on my own, and that became part of the role as well.
What did all that look like for you? I mean, was it still a traditional role with just a cool title, or what was involved?
I think it was really 2 things. So one part of the role was very traditional. We had 6 or 7 patent lawyers across the globe, and they were embedded in the 5 divisions. So part of what we did is we said, let's take those professionals and put them with one manager, which was me, and start to create common processes and principles across all of Smiths Group for the patent lawyers and the trademark lawyers. So that, I think, is pretty common in what a lot of enterprises do. The other piece was helping the head of digital set up his organization. That was a bit non-traditional. And then the third piece, I think, is becoming more common, but at the time it was a bit more rare, which was really innovating in law, trying to figure out how we at Smith Group could create competitive advantage within the legal team by being innovative, whether that's buying software, building software, or changing our people and our processes.
Would you mind just kind of describing or alluding to the size of the legal department at Smith Group and why there was space for you?
Smith Group has about 60 attorneys across the world. And for me, when I joined, I was very fortunate to get a job at Smith Group because I had been an associate general counsel at several organizations, and I was really eager to be a general counsel. And so I was hired 10 years ago to be a divisional general counsel for one of the 5 divisions. My background was sort of high-tech, media, internet, telecom, and software. I did have some of the elements that Smith Group needed, which was government contracts, corporate governance. So they took a chance on me, and I went from being largely a software high-tech lawyer to a generalist industrial general counsel for the last 10 years. The reason I think I didn't leave Smith Group is because this change happened about 4 years ago, where Smith Group realized it needed to be more software-centric, which is my true passion and my background. And so Smith Group in some ways came back to what was more natural for me, and it gave me a chance to have a second act at Smith Group. First act was general counsel of my industrial division, but the second act was very exciting. It was going back to my roots as a software lawyer and also getting into the modernization of the practice of law.
So Jay, share with the audience what you guys did on the innovation side and apropos to your, as you say, your background. What did you guys get into? What did you discover? Did you guys create anything? Talk about that evolution or process with corporate legal department innovation.
The first thing we did was not technology. So the first thing we did, I saw all of the AI software being developed by the technology startups, but it wasn't really being adopted. And if I'm being honest, I didn't understand 4 or 5 years ago how we would use AI at Smith Group in the legal team. It was early days, and actually the AI wasn't very good, but we still wanted to innovate. So I thought, let's go to the core practice of law, which is still the people, or at least back then it was still the people. And I tried to find one big problem. And one of the big problems is that we often used outside counsel in areas where we didn't need the sophistication and the cost of outside counsel. So to give you an example, when you have too much work, so it's not sophisticated, it's just a volume problem. You have too much work coming in for your team. You can either take longer to do the work, which makes your business clients very unhappy, or traditionally you would send it to outside counsel and you would pay that premium just to get the work done. So we thought, isn't there at least a third option and maybe a fourth and fifth option? Let's create our own captive legal consultancy. Let's go out and try to find great lawyers, not just good lawyers, but let's find the best lawyers we can, one by one, without advertising. And if we can find them, we can train them, and they won't be employees, but they're also not a law firm. But let's make them loyal to Smiths, understand Smiths, and whenever we need them, they're available at a fraction of the cost of a big firm. And over a 3-year period, we went from, sort of failure where we couldn't find any of these great people that we had dreamed of to having about 20 of them. We found them one by one, former Gibson Dunn, former Skadden, former Morgan Lewis, and we brought them in, and they supported Smith Group across the globe when employees either didn't have the technical expertise to do something or didn't have the time, but we didn't want to go to an expensive law firm.
So you mentioned captive legal consultancy, but it really is, you guys grew your legal department with attorneys. Is that correct?
We did, but they weren't employees.
Oh, interesting.
And that was an important distinction, I think, both for the consultants as well as for our employees, because our employees are uniquely valuable because they know the business and they really have an institutional knowledge that you can't beat. So the employees remained whatever number we had at the start of this project, but we needed something other than a law firm. And so this was a group of consultants. The consultants could do work for anyone. We didn't restrict them. So they could have gone out and worked for 10 companies, including Smith's. But because we typically found them when they weren't working, either because they had gone out on maternity leave and stayed out or some other reason, we brought them back into their practice of law, into their career, and they had a very high loyalty to us, and therefore they frequently didn't do work for anyone else except Smith's.
That's so fascinating. Was it an actual entity, or were they all independent consultants in the structure of this?
They were all independent.
Got it. Okay. Fascinating. So I know that was a component of what you did, which I love. Definitely, as you described, the volume, saving dollars. Was there a software component you guys got into as well?
There was. So I guess two answers to that. The first answer is that building the captive consultancy, which we called Project Indio, was so much harder than we thought, because you don't just need the consultants, which is the end product and the end result. You needed everything else along the way. We needed marketing, we needed financial help, we needed website development, all of those things you need to build a startup or a company of any type. We had the painful job of finding all of those people first before we could get to building the consultancy. So coming out of that, once the consultancy worked and took off, we were looking for something else to do to improve the department. But we already had all of these non-legal resources in place that I just outlined, all of the financial and marketing people and developers. And so we decided to look at other problems that we saw across the department. And the second problem we identified was kind of simple contracts. Are we dealing with simple contracts in too complicated a way? Are we essentially giving them too much dignity and spending too much time marking them up? And so we developed our own piece of software that would handle short, simple contracts in a very fast, elegant way. You can't do this with all contracts, but we built an app and a portal solution that was also mobile so that commercial teams could quickly send in contracts to the legal team, who could then view them and maybe 80% of the time dispense with them with the click of a button or the click of a couple buttons. And the goal there was not to change the world, and it wasn't to change how we practice all of law. The goal was really to identify just a second area where we could make improvement, and both make that improvement and also see if we could develop our own software rather than just buy it off the shelf.
So two things come to mind. I imagine you're motivated for cost savings purposes, and then also you're wanting a better product versus taking it off the shelf. Is that correct from both of what you mentioned, Project Indigo and the app?
I think the app, it had huge cost savings, yes. If you can do it yourself rather than buy it off the shelf, where you end up paying license fees typically in perpetuity, either on a monthly or an annual basis, you save a lot of money. I tend not to try to innovate to save money. I think it can take you down the wrong road. Your creativity kind of dwindles and you end up focusing on the cash. I think we did it for your second reason, really, so that it was the best fit for Smith's Group and for my division, John Crane. If you build it yourself for yourself, probably have a lower chance of success. But if you do succeed, it's a much tighter fit for what you want. And that's what we were trying to achieve. So rather than build it by something that was built for the market and would probably be good for John Crane, we were trying to build something that was just for us and great for us. And I think we succeeded. I mean, you tend to succeed if you do that because you know yourself very well.
Was there resistance to this approach that could be conceived non-traditional within Smith's Group?
I don't think there wasn't really active resistance. Nobody was saying that's a bad idea. But I think there is the common wisdom, which is often right, that we're a legal team, so why would we bother becoming a development team as well? And I think that was a conversation I was always excited to have, and I think it's a valid critique. And I've heard it from outsiders as well. Kind of, why would you do that? You're clearly not a software development shop, and so the chances of building a great product are low, and you should spend your time being a lawyer. So yeah, there was some resistance, and I think it was fair. The reason we started with a very small app is for that reason. I think if we had tried to build a contract, a CLM, a life cycle management system, that criticism would have been dead on accurate. Why would, Jay and his team build a big complex piece of software that others can do far better? But I think if you build small things and you do it for different reasons, one is to solve a problem, but we also did it to wake ourselves up to the idea of law tech, and we did it to kind of understand what is possible and what is this new industry about. So because we had multiple reasons for doing it, we thought it was a good idea.
I guess one thing that makes a lot of sense to me is you guys are, the Smiths Group is a software innovation company. So you guys are already in the mode of innovating, and maybe this was just part of the DNA of Smiths Group. Is that correct?
I think it was part of the new DNA for sure. I think starting in 2016, we became very focused on software innovation as opposed to general industrial innovation, which Smiths has always been focused on. And I think it was, on my part at least, it was trying to fit in. We had a new management team that gave us clear and kind of slightly different direction that we were going to be both a hardware innovator and a software innovator. And I frankly hadn't been innovating very much at that time in 2016. I've been focused just on doing my job. And I certainly wasn't using software in the practice of law. So for me, it was a way to fit in again with the new Smiths.
Are you guys working on anything, or is the corporate legal team working on anything specific that's another product or a new innovation?
So I've been at Smiths Group for 10 years, but my last day was yesterday. So I'm sure Smiths Group will continue to innovate, but it won't be at my direction. So I guess time will tell what Smiths is working on.
Jay, what advice would you give in-house attorneys with either your skills or curiosity, and then also corporate legal departments interested in creating a role or going in this direction with an interest towards innovation, doing things differently?
I think it's really important to put yourself in the community you want to be in. So if you're a corporate in-house attorney, you're already in one community. In fact, you're in many. You're in your business community, you're in your legal team, you're part of the legal community. But I would say the law tech community is very different. It's not just the ops community. The ops community tends to be focused on efficiency, which is very important, and it's a big new part of law. But I would say don't just focus on ops and billing systems and efficiency. Put yourself in an innovation community. And there are many of them out there. I think this podcast is part of it, listening to speakers on these topics.
Thank you.
But it's also meeting those types of speakers. But it's also important to not spend time just with lawyer innovators, because lawyer innovators are still lawyers. I think it's really important to spend time with the people who are rebuilding our industry. And many of those people aren't lawyers. They're just software engineers or creative designers. I think it's really important if you want to get into law tech innovation that you spend time with those people and not just listening to speeches, but actually talking to them.
What communities do you recommend?
Yeah, there are a few. I think my favorite one personally is Legal Geek. It's an organization started by Jimmy Vestberg, and he currently manages it. It's based in London. He does a number of things throughout the year. But one of the things he does is he has an annual conference in London. I think he's done 3 or 4 of them. They're increasingly big, increasingly popular, and they're a lot of fun. He just had his first conference stateside in New York City. I went to that. A little different flavor in the States. Law tech is different over here, but it was also very fun. And I would say the other one that is a completely different format, but it's called SOLID. And it's an acronym, I think, for maybe legal innovation and design. But that's a great conference that's run on the West Coast and it's run on the East Coast. And recently, I think he had one in Canada and in Shanghai, and that's a great one.
And that's David Cowan, I think, or Cohen, I believe it is.
Correct.
Okay, very good. Let's jump into a topic I know that we're both excited to talk about. So where is in-house corporate legal department innovation headed, Jay? You had initially just talked to me kind of before we got started about last 5 years and the next 5 years and, the non-legal community's influence. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Sure. So I guess I would say, just from my experience and my vantage point, the last 5 years were really defined by the technologists. the technologists who were generally not lawyers were moving from fintech, which had been a big emerging industry over the last decade, and they were starting to move out of fintech onto the next vertical, and the next vertical was law. And so you had a lot of software development the last 5 years focused on artificial intelligence, blockchain, smart contracts. That was happening out in the world, but I don't think corporate legal teams were buying that software. It was pretty cutting edge stuff. It's very hard to implement. It's not very mature. So the software has been developed, but it hasn't been adopted. I think that's changing for sure. In the next 5 years, and maybe the next 10 to 20 years, will really be about adopting this software, figuring out what works and what works for you, and changing the way your legal team is run in corporate enterprises.
Tell me about disruption when it comes to corporate legal. I mean, it seems like there's a real move, and you mentioned this a little bit. So this idea of a balanced legal resource ecosystem and only having a choice of, do we let in-house do it or do we let outside counsel do it? So I know legal tech is continuously, in essence, maybe in some ways taking away from large law firms or law firms in general. What do you see happening over the next 5-10 years or going in the future as far as that evolution within corporate legal departments this way?
That's a good intro, because I hadn't really thought of it as the taking away from big law, but that's certainly what's happening, or at least starting to happen. And I have a slightly different view on, in my opinion, I'm not, as a general counsel, looking to stop using law firms. I think law firms have supported me very well, and I think they will have a place for a long time. I am very focused on using the right resource, and I think historically, general counsels, myself included, we often don't use the best resource. We make this binary choice between our staff, because they know the business best and they're there and they're available if they have time, and law firms that are also available, but they don't know your business very well, but they have other advantages of being a law firm. So you choose between those. Project Indio was a chance to say, shouldn't there be a third choice that we have? And that worked out very well. And it really opened my mind to this idea that it's not 3 choices. It might not even be 10. It might be 20 different choices of populations of lawyers that you should be choosing amongst when any matter comes in the door. Now, that sounds very complicated, right? Because you don't want to every time be calling 20 different people to see if they're available. But I think the introduction of software and the combination of software with that choice creates the possibility of a really dynamic ecosystem where you can very easily, via software, have a task come in the door, decide who is the right provider of service on that task, whether it's a law firm, your staff, or someone else, and get it back out the door and get somebody working on it. So I think it's that opportunity that I know many companies are working on right now. That opportunity is a really big one, because it could change how you define team. Instead of team just being your team, or maybe just being your team plus your trusted law firm, team could really have a much broader definition. And it could work seamlessly if you have the right people and the right software.
So that definitely brings up the question I have around alternative service providers. What are you seeing out there that maybe my audience would be intrigued to learn about as far as innovating things happening with alternative service providers? Again, there is definitely a resounding respect for large law firms, but there is a shift in the industry towards other providers, as you're kind of mentioning, like the captive consultancy. Can you share about that, Jay?
Sure. I guess from my perspective, 10 years ago, Axiom was really incredibly cutting edge and really compelling. They were offering an alternative to the in-house lawyer. It was an external alternative, but it was really an external general counsel that you could hire either based a couple hours a day, a couple days a week. I think Axiom started the trend in a very big way, and Axiom today is very big, has been very successful, and is now breaking into 3 pieces, one of which is the people business. So I think Axiom started it. I think many companies have followed in their footsteps, and so you have lots of these smaller alternative providers across the globe. The other thing you have is you have the law firms recognizing that they cannot just be a single kind of monolithic option. And so a lot of the big law firms have created their own captive, either consultancy or captive law firm, that is quite a bit cheaper, does more routine work, and supports the law firm. And then some of them also have a team that's kind of like Axiom, that is sort of designed to go support directly the in-house team. So I guess in answer to your question, I think the people business of law is kind of splintering in a good way. It's splintering into the exact type of ecosystem we're going to see in the future, where instead of having this binary choice between two things that are very different, your staff and your law firm, you're going to have this whole spectrum of providers. And if you can get to know them and get to trust them, which I think is a big part of it, you can have a really dynamic team that serves your enterprise.
So I want to just bring up what continues to be the elephant in the room of the big accounting firms. And again, I had interviewed Jeremy Fudge, managing partner of BAL, that spun off their assets of one of the largest corporate immigration law firms in the United States and exited their non-U.S. operations to Deloitte. I'm also noticing there was an announcement today. Epstein Becker Green has their alliance with Deloitte and just picked up a very high-level global employment lawyer, I believe is from Proskauer. And she's a Band 1 Chambers and Partners ranked attorney. What's happening? What are you seeing from a kind of a consumer perspective of what's happening with accounting as it is affecting this industry?
It's really interesting. And I don't know that I'm certainly not the expert on this, but I guess from my perspective, I think it's fascinating what's happening with the Big Four. The Big Four today, in my opinion, are not substitutes for law firms, and it's not even close. Law firms are really organized centrally. So you have a big IP team and a big litigation team, and they work together, and they train each other, and they're very focused on client needs. The Big Four have a lot of lawyers, but they tend to have lawyers in very small pockets around the world. And they're not set up in practice groups. They're set up geographically. So if you have 1,000 accountants in Asia Pac, you might only have 50 lawyers if you're KPMG in Asia Pac. And they're not even set up together as 50. They're set up as 2 over here in this office and 5 in this office. So they play a very different role. They play more of an in-house role because they support in-house teams than they do a practice group, monolithic kind of law firm type model. So that I would say is a difference between the law firms and the Big Four today. But another difference goes, I think, in their favor, which is that because they don't have this heritage, they weren't a law firm before, so they don't have to continue being a law firm tomorrow. Their vision of the future is much more dynamic. They plan to practice law. They plan to buy software companies and use that in the practice of law. They are unencumbered by many of the things the law firms are. And so I think what you will see is they'll be more innovative, they'll be more nimble. And what the future holds for them, I don't know. I don't know if they'll try to become 4 more big law firms or whether they'll become something different. But I do think today they're very different.
It's interesting. I was bringing this up as an anecdote, but I heard a rumor, let's call it that. So Walmart is having sweeping changes and reorganization and massive layoffs, of which they've kind of denied, but there's lots and lots of people finding new jobs, including their corporate legal department. And a number of their corporate legal department are actually being assigned to Deloitte. And I believe that Deloitte is taking on a large part of their corporate legal department in sort of a insourced, outsourced function contract role. And it's just interesting to kind of hear. I think some of that is, you wonder how that could be the case, but it appears to be what could be happening and what could be coming down the pipe for the future.
Yeah, I think that's right. The last 5 years, I've only read about it. I've heard about it in conferences, and it's definitely happening, and potentially in a big way over the next 24 months, is corporates are deciding there's a piece of work that's non-strategic and non-kind of business-centric, where you have to know the business inside and out. And it's just kind of routine legal work. So rather than going to our law firm because it's routine, and rather than keep it with our staff who are very focused on understanding the business in a kind of unique way, let's take this third piece of work and not just outsource it, but let's actually take it outside of our team. So not just send it out, but move the whole business outside. And so you see it with United Lex, which is not one of the Big Four, but they are sort of an Axiom-like independent. They've been doing this with corporates. They take many of the staff, move them onto their payroll, and continue to provide the services back to the corporate. But then also they have this incentive that maybe the corporate doesn't quite have and the law firms don't quite have as well, which is rigorously introduce software, rigorously introduce efficiency, rigorously train, which firms do a decent job of. I think corporates do less of a good job of continually training their professionals. But if you're United Lex or you're KPMG or Deloitte, you now have these professionals. You can constantly imbue them with software and training, and you can also move them on to other client work. So not only are they continuing to do the outsourced work from their original employer, but they can do a variety of things, which makes them more dynamic and is better for their career. So you're seeing that more and more. I don't know if this is a huge trend or maybe just a few corporates will do it, but I think we'll know a lot more in the next 24 months.
Jay, I want to bring up a subject you had mentioned earlier about the chief of staff role. You said this was of interest to yours going into law school. Can you allude to that and help us understand what you see coming forward for chief of staff?
When I said chief of staff, or one of the uses of the word was, for me personally, I went to law school because I was a government major at Georgetown and I wanted to go into politics, but I didn't really want to be a politician. I wanted to be what I viewed as kind of a working lawyer. So I wanted to be the chief of staff to a politician where I could go do all the work and the politician would go out and set policy and sell policy to the public. And I thought that's what I wanted to do with my career. So I went to law school. During law school, I decided I didn't think politics was the right path for me. I thought industry was. So I changed direction and I went in-house and I went to a law firm and I became a more classic lawyer. But starting about 5 years ago, I realized depending on the size of your job and depending on the size of your corporate, there really is a role for a chief of staff on your staff. And that person has a very different job than you have. As a general counsel, you're caught up in a variety of different things. It's kind of a high volume job, but it's also a high mix job where you're doing lots of different things, corporate, executive, strategic, sitting in meetings, traveling. You need somebody at home driving your agenda. And I think if you can afford to have a chief of staff, they really pay for themselves because they can work with your team, they can work with your counterparts, they can make sure things progress in a very steady way. And also that you innovate, that your team gets better. Now, there are a variety of these roles out there. You have deputy general counsels. Yep. They do a lot of this. Yep. You have this new emerging role, head of legal operations. Yep. They do quite a bit of this. So I'm not suggesting it's a totally new role, but I do think increasingly you'll see the new title, chief of staff, at very big organizations. And it's pretty specific and it's a pretty powerful role because they form this interface between the entire organization, including your own team, and the general counsel, who sometimes doesn't have time to do all the classic roles of management and training and development and strategic decision making. It's a way to replicate yourself if you don't have enough time.
Kind of customary in my podcast episodes, I like to touch on more just personal subjects for people to get a feel for you, Jay. Please, if you wouldn't mind, describe or share where you call home and tell us a little bit about how you and your family are enjoying your summer right now.
I would say I call home California. I grew up in Maryland and outside of Washington, D.C., and I spent almost half my life there. I did a bike trip down the West Coast after law school, and I just found it fascinating. Nice. And in particular, I found Los Angeles to be like landing on the moon. It was so different to me than anything I had ever seen. And so my wife and I spent 9 years there, and we had our 2 girls there, and now we're in San Francisco. And so California to me is home.
That's excellent. And so what have you guys done this summer to enjoy the state of California?
The main thing we've done is we've stayed in California. So we decided this summer, we've only been back in San Francisco for 2 years. So we decided this summer was going to be about staying local. So we went down to Ventura, which is north of LA, spent some time on the beach. We went up to Mendocino, which is very different. It's cool up there and it's quiet. And we spent some time on the coast there. And we've stayed local. So our house is a couple miles from Muir Woods. And so we can drive up and over the hill and we're on the coast there. And we spend a lot of time in the woods hiking. So we've stayed local and we've tried to be outdoors.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. So I understand that you're a reader. What are you finding on your nightstand these days? How are you consuming content? What are you reading?
I guess I'll give you two answers. One is I like reading about a variety of things. So for that, I go to a website called medium.com. And Medium, I'm sure you've seen it. It's sort of a creative design technology website. And so they have articles by all sorts of different contributors on a variety of topics. So to me, that's kind of home base. That's what I go to every day and try to stay current with new and emerging trends. Something I had avoided for the last 5 years because I didn't quite see how it fit into my world was blockchain. But that is consuming most of my specific reading. So I'm reading a number of books. And right now, one is called How Money Got Free. And it's by far the most entertaining of the bunch because it's really telling the story of kind of the blockchain and the Bitcoin Wild West, where people created this cryptocurrency and were getting thrown in jail because they were doing illegal things. But it takes you through the entire arc of the Wild West of cryptocurrency to where it is today. And I'm only about halfway through it, so I'm still in the Wild West where they're all being thrown in jail. But I now see that it's going to be a really huge part, not only of the financial services industry, where I think it has its most specific application, but it's going to be a big part of law as well.
Jay, I have to ask, do you get into fiction much?
Yeah, I do. Right now, I'm not reading much fiction, but I love the more you can read kind of outside your day-to-day, I think it helps you as a professional, so I do.
Yeah. Have you read Ready Player One?
No, I think I've seen my girls talking about the movie and their friends have seen it, but I have not.
So I've been told that it is considered maybe one of the top read books by tech CEOs because of how near term it's kind of predicting the future of technology and what's happening there around VR and maybe the future of the internet. Maybe something for you to check out.
Absolutely. The future of the internet, I think, is really fascinating because that is where I think blockchain is going. I sort of see blockchain as being potentially the rebirth or the rebuild of the internet on a completely different protocol.
I personally am very intrigued by it too. I'll warn you, my disclaimer is Ready Player One's very much kind of in the teenage theme genre. So there's lots of fun stuff in there. But it's all 80s themed, which seems to be a real focus these days on radio and movies. But it's rather entertaining too. And what's interesting about Ready Player One, I personally believe, and what I'm seeing is it's bringing up a lot of real near-term predictions, saying like using VR to create a new form of public school that protects students from violence, because then you could go to public school within your home versus going to a public place. It also just talks about the lifestyle of vending and vending machines and things that are available by vending. It's very fascinating, the future predictive nature of what it's doing. It alludes to the future operating systems. And I just can't help but notice Facebook buying Oculus and kind of going after VR themselves. I think they could be the next Microsoft is my prediction. Love to hear your thoughts.
Well, yeah, I think that's fascinating. And it is interesting that you say so many CEOs are reading it. So sounds like we have CEOs reading it and 14-year-olds, and I'm neither of those, so I should probably read it.
That's awesome.
So, you mentioned Facebook. I've been on Facebook for a long time, but I just do not use it actively. But their announcement of a cryptocurrency, not only that they were going to introduce one, but that they have a panel of some of the biggest financial and business institutions in the world that are joining them to do this.
Yeah.
Has really changed my outlook on Facebook. And then what you just said about AR and VR, its applications are so broad, not only training and education, but think about all the times we fly across the world. We do it all the time in corporate America. We fly across the world for meetings, which are admittedly much better in person. But the impact that has on the environment and just cost impact, you could do a lot of that as soon as the technology gets good enough. And I think it is in places, but it's very expensive. Once the cost comes down, maybe 80% of the meetings you get on the plane for, you won't need to anymore.
I have to agree with you. I think there's a lot of radical changes coming. Facebook sells their Oculus headsets for $200 to $400 that don't need a computer. It's just amazing. So maybe it would be worth having another conversation with you in about 3 to 5 years to see where all that's at.
It may be, but I think, you should have Mark Zuckerberg on, and he can give it to you from the horse's mouth.
That would be fun. If you have connections, please let me know. So I want to give airtime. We're about to wrap this up, but I want to give you airtime to something I think my audience would want to hear. Share your story about what inspired you to get into everything we've talked about. Share your story about your dad. My dad, just, when we were growing up, I was born in New Jersey, but when I was, 5 years old, he was working with IBM. So this would have been 1975. Kind of early days of programming. They were still using some punch cards and very rudimentary technologies, but IBM was one of the leaders, if not the leader globally, in software development and in hardware. And he was relocated to Clear Lake City, Houston, in Texas, in order to help with the launch of the first space shuttle. So he was a software engineer for IBM, but he was working on the NASA client and the NASA project. And so growing up, he worked at IBM, and I found that to be really interesting. And he taught me some coding early on. He bought me an Apple IIe, which is the computer I wanted, even though he worked at IBM. And I loved the Apple IIe. And so I did a lot of coding growing up. I wanted to program video games. That was my real passion. But then, you grow up, you go to college, you go to law school, and software kind of fell into the rear view for me, except I started working for technology companies. So I had software clients, but I didn't use software in my practice of law at all, really, other than email. But then fast forward to 5 years ago, and, the world is changing. And all of a sudden, I made the connection between what I used to love, software, and what was happening in law. And it was really the same thing. And so I think it relit a fire for me. And it's something I'm really passionate about and interested in. And I'm sure it will be part of my career and all of our careers for the rest of our career. Jay, last question. Knowing what you know about yourself now in the industry that you're in and what you've done, would you be doing something different? Meaning, would you look back and have done it differently? Or, how would you have approached knowing what you know about yourself now?
I think the one thing I wouldn't have dropped the creative side as much as I did. I found myself very focused on becoming a good lawyer and having a good career. And during the period I was doing that, the way to do that was to focus on the law and to learn business. But that's really where I put my effort. I wish if I could do it again, I would have put a lot more effort into creativity, innovation, design, and just doing things that were a little bit more risky. Not risky for your clients, but risky for you. Because I think risk for you personally, even if you fail 80% of the time, it's okay. It's for you. But that 20% of the time, by taking risks, it really improves you as a person. So I'm doing that for sure now. But I think even young lawyers should really be a little more adventurous and take some risks. I think it will benefit them increasingly in their careers.
Jay, it's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Chris. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone who listened to this episode of the Law Firm Leadership Podcast. If you have questions or would like to recommend someone to be on the podcast, please email them to podcast@findthelions.com. If you like this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes. Also, share our podcast via email or social media. To share our podcast, listen to more shows, or to read the transcription of this audio, go to liongrouprerecruiting.com/podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Law Firm Leadership Podcast. This podcast is for education purposes only. This content cannot be used for commercial use without written permission from the Lion Group. If you like this podcast, leave a review on iTunes.